I'm Alan Shiner. I'm head of the Israel Committee, if you don't know me, although I think everyone here probably does. But I'm glad you're here because I'm very eager to hear from Dr. Itzhak Brook, who was gracious enough to join us from Washington, D.C., where he is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Medical School. He is a Navy veteran of 27 years, I think you just told me. 27 years. He retired from the Navy in 2006. And prior to that, Dr. Brook grew up in Israel and served in the Israel Defense Forces and served as a doctor in the reserves in the Yom Kippur War, which is what he's going to speak about tonight. He was also served in the reserves in the 1967 war as well. He's the author of this book, In the Sands of Sinai, Physician's Account of the Yom Kippur War, which is on sale right out there. And I encourage you to get a copy. But anyway, please join me in welcoming Dr. Itzhak Brook.
Thank you. Good evening to you. As you can hear and see, I have a rather challenging voice. I don't have vocal cords. I really don't like this one. I'm going to change it.
What happened?
We have a small room, and so I think this microphone will work better, less resonant. I'm happy to be here tonight and speak to you about my experiences in the Yom Kippur War. As you can see and hear, I have a rather challenging voice because I had throat cancer and I don't have vocal cords, but I can still speak, and hopefully you can understand me. The Yom Kippur War was one of the most sentinel moments in Israel history. Israel was attacked at the holiest day of the Jewish calendar by both Syria and Egypt, where most of the people in the country were in the synagogues, and the borders with Egypt and Syria were very, very sparsely defended. There were very few soldiers in the Suez Canal, only about 500 reservists that was spread over a 70-mile-long canal. And in the Golanite, fortunately, there were more soldiers. There were 2 battalions, and they were about 2,000 men, and they were fortunately the best battalion of tanks Israel had. And they actually were able to stop the Syrians in the northern part of the Golanite
unstoppable.
They had the feeling that they are winning. Our forces, for the first time, suddenly felt that they cannot stop the Egyptians.
The morale was so high of everyone, even who lost his sight, even who was with amputated legs, but very happy that he has done something for his country.
In the north, Syrian artillery troops and armor blasted Israeli positions on the Golan Heights. Israeli tanks were outnumbered 10 to 1. The north of the country was at risk. Israeli armored forces stormed across the Sinai Desert to retain positions. Blood-sagging rockets fired by Egyptian infantry proved deadly against the Israeli tanks. Previously undefeatable Israeli pilots now faced a new reality. Egyptian SAM missiles brought down dozens of Israeli jets.
I remember coming to the canal when I arrived in my division after 24 hours of going with our tanks across the desert on chains. I saw a young officer. He looked at me, I was like that. He could not believe. He said, we cannot stop them. We cannot stop them.
Egyptian and Israeli tanks engaged in the Sinai. It was the largest clash of armor since the World War II Battle of El Alamein. The Egyptian advance was contained. In the north, Israel turned the Syrians back to the 1967 lines and then continued to push deep into Syrian territory. The turning point in the south came when General Ariel Sharon decided to attack the Egyptians from the rear. The building of the bridgehead across the Suez Canal took place under a massive artillery barrage.
It was a terrible night. I think a dead night. We lost, from my division, about 300 killed and around 1,000 wounded. And all of us, from soldiers to the division commander, we all were fighting there. Well, maybe the most terrible night I ever seen.
Sharon's plan succeeded. Israel advanced into Egypt, cutting off tens of thousands of Egyptian troops in the Sinai. A ceasefire came into effect. The price of war had been devastating. 2,700 Israelis killed and thousands more wounded. More than 18,000 Arab soldiers had lost their lives.
It was a war, really, of soldiers. Because the courage and the sacrifice they had to show was unbelievable. They didn't speak about fathers of 4 and 5 and 6 children who were fighting. And I may call it even the war of fathers and sons.
That history
Israeli and
may
Egyptian
record
officers signed a ceasefire.
one day that the initial step towards understanding, reconciliation, and peace in the Middle East began here at kilometer 101.
The 1973 war left Israelis grim and somber. The dead and wounded, the grief and shock had taken a heavy physical and psychological toll. Soldiers and officers returning from the front were bitter. Many staged demonstrations. They asked who was responsible.
The country was in a state of shock after the war. Indeed, the and I recall